Yes, we can.
Okay. So this is a session on unusual superconductors. And so in fact, this morning, there was an article in Nature News on such an unusual superconductor. But that's not what I'm going to talk about today, but they are in the same class. So I'm going to talk about this paper on magnetic field screening in a hydride, so-called hydride superconductor, which was published in 2022, and about the fact that the data are supposed to be available, the data that underline that support the findings of the study. So for the case of the room temperature superconductor that this news article I just showed talks about, the same was true. There was a data availability statement that the data were available upon reasonable request. In October 2021, like was almost a year after the paper was published, the Science published this news saying that I had been trying to get those data for nearly a year and couldn't, because the author was giving various reasons why the data shouldn't be available. But finally, those data did become available in December 2021. As a consequence of that, the paper was retracted from the fact that we found anomalies in those data. So in this paper, there is also data availability statement, and there is reasons why I think it's important that we look at those data. So I asked the authors over a year ago to supply, please, the underlying data for this paper. And so I would like to tell you why is this paper important. And that is because it is really the first potentially valid magnetic evidence for superconductivity in this class of hydride superconductors. There were other claims of magnetic evidence, for example, this one, but then we found that there were serious problems with it, for example, in this paper here, and then in work with my colleague Frank Marsiglio, we analyzed a lot of these papers that have claimed this evidence in the past. So in this particular paper, they show this magnetic moment versus magnetic field that shows a diamagnetic response that then turns over when you reach a critical field. And if we look at standard superconductors, that's the way that they behave. If it's a type 1 superconductor, then diamagnetism disappears suddenly. If it's a type 2 superconductor, it gradually goes to zero. And the point where it goes to zero is HC2, the upper critical field. Now, for this material, the upper critical field is enormous, about 100 Tesla. And this scale here is millitesla, so it's very unusual that this would turn over so sharply when in a type 2 superconductor, it goes very gradually like this. This would be an ideal type 2 superconductor. Now, when we have pinning, it's even worse. So the magnetic moment, the diamagnetism even persists beyond the HC1 because of pinning of the vortices by strong pinning centers. There's other unusual features of this magnetization data. So the paper shows on figure 3a the magnetic moment as you apply a field. Those are called the Virgin curves. And then on figure 3e, it shows what it calls a hysteretic part of the magnetic moment versus field. And these are these curves here. So I looked at these curves and I asked myself, well, why aren't these curves the same as these? Because they are measuring the same thing. So I wrote to the authors back in October 2022 asking why do these curves on figure 3a and 3e look so different? And here I'm plotting those curves in the same graph. So the plot from figure 3a at 100 Kelvin is this one, and from figure 3e, this would be the Virgin curve where you first apply the magnetic field would be this one, and they are very different. So why is that? We asked the authors to explain, they didn't respond. We asked the authors to send us the raw data. They didn't respond. So then we wrote a paper in May 2023 posing these questions. Then finally, what happened in September 2023 is that the authors published an author correction where they said that in fact, the raw magnetization curves were not the ones that they had plotted. There was a significant diamagnetic response of the miniature high-pressure cell, which increases with applied magnetic field, and that was, and then a linear background was subtracted. And so then they also point out that these linear manipulations do not affect the onset of the deviation of the curve from linear dependence. Why is that important? If we look at the figure on the left, the point where the curve deviates from the linear behavior is what signals the lower critical field. So there were linear manipulations to bring us from this curve to this curve. And in this curve, the point where it deviates from linearity, 67 millitesla, gives us the critical field at the 100 Kelvin. In order for this to be valid, these transformations have to be linear. But I wrote this paper a few months ago pointing out that how can linear transformations bend a straight line? Because this line looks pretty straight. This line does not. When we put them in bigger pictures, this line from which a linear background is subtracted, and then it becomes this light blue line, there's something wrong here. Here they are plotted on the same scale. And as I say, this doesn't seem to fit. The same at another temperature, this is for 140 Kelvin. The data here are on a straight line, up and down from a straight line, and here they are all systematically beyond the straight line. So also you can take the data and digitize them and subtract the straight line. So if you do that with this data, you get the data here, which look very different from the light blue line here, which is supposed to be obtained the way I'm describing. So how the data in figure 3a result from the measured data of figure 3e remains an unfathomable mystery. To discover that, I think it would be useful to look at the raw data. So is it reasonable to ask for the raw data? Is that covered by the data availability statement? I asked the authors, as I said before, and I asked also the journal. So the journal editor says that the data, well, the authors don't want to share the data, and the journal is not in a position to adjudicate disputes between readers and authors on such subjective issues of what's a reasonable request. Reasonable is a subjective term. And they also cannot write an editorial note stating the data are not available because the data, they say, were provided to the journal. Is this an ethical publishing policy? I asked COPE, the Committee on Publication Ethics, and but sometime I will tell you what they said. The question I would like to understand is why are the authors unwilling to share those data? In the previous case of the room temperature superconductor, they said they don't trust me to appraise the data fairly, and in fact, one of the authors of this paper said that I'm not objective sometimes, perhaps. But the data were shared in the case of Ranga Dias and Salamat for CSH, and they did it for the sake of the broader scientific community. So I wonder whether Eremets and Minkoff will live up to the Dias and Salamat standards for the sake of the broader scientific community. Another anomaly of this data is that if you look at the hysteresis loops that they published, and you compare them with the virgin data, in the same scale, they look like this, while for a standard superconductor, this is what it looks like. The virgin data joins the hysteresis loop. So in the journal website, where there's a comment section, I wrote that I would like to encourage other readers interested in this topic to make reasonable requests for data so we finally learn what's going on. Because if the curves in this figure result from linear transformations on measured data, that would be very strong evidence for superconductivity. If not, figure 3c that extracts the lower critical field, a very important quantity, would be not valid because of what I explained. And so this would mean that this is not evidence for superconductivity at all. Now, the authors don't want you to know which one of the two statements is true because they are not sharing the data. Why don't they want us to know? I'd like to suggest that maybe that is the most important question to answer. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope to get some questions.